All right, and I'm going to go ahead, Dr. Cavanaugh, and play the little timer thing, and then we'll get started.
Sounds great.
All right, I would like to take a moment, of course, and welcome you to Love Over Coffee, Voices Not Heard. This is a platform and a podcast for the marginalized, the silenced, and the abused. And for those of you out there who are listening and watching, this show is supposed to be an organic conversation that grows over perhaps a cup of coffee or whatever your drink of choice is, and wherever your location may be. And basically, I believe that two people have a conversation, and even if they agree to disagree at the end of the conversation, perhaps something has been shared that is reflective, either of you or of them, that brings it back to a processing moment, something that was shared with you, a lived experience that was shared with you that perhaps you might never have. So, my guest tonight is Dr. Cavanaugh, John Cavanaugh, and I always start with the same question, Dr. Cavanaugh, and that is, tell us who you are, where you've been, and where you're going.
Well, thanks, Tina, and thanks for the privilege of being on your show. I've looked forward to this and want to thank you for the work that you're doing with it. I really like these kinds of open-ended questions because it lets you just sort of wander around the recesses of your brain in a sense to think about where you've been and all. And that's sort of, I guess the easy thing is to start with. I was born in Terre Haute, Indiana, and lived there for about 3 years. My dad was working for the DuPont company a little bit north of Terre Haute at the time. And like a lot of companies in the 1950s, when they closed that plant, they offered him a transfer. And so he took it. And so we moved to Wilmington, Delaware. And by that point, I had a younger brother along with us. So when I was 3, we packed up and moved to Delaware. And interestingly, that was supposed to just be a temporary thing for a couple years. And then where we were supposed to go is Johnson City, Tennessee. But as corporate things happened in those days, everybody who they said was going to be permanently in Wilmington ended up in Johnson City, and everybody who they said was going to go to Johnson City ended up in Wilmington. So that's where I grew up.
Those curveballs, I call those life curveballs, where only God can put the spin on it, right?
Yeah. So I kind of learned early on that life isn't always what you think it's going to be, right? And so I spent my growing up years as it were in Wilmington. But the interesting thing from my point of view is that because all of our family was back in Terre Haute, or some of them had moved to Indianapolis, we spent summers when I was growing up back in Terre Haute. Mm-hmm. So my mom and my brother and I would go back. My dad would take some time off and drive us out, and he'd go back to Wilmington, go back to work. But we'd spend most of the summer back in Terre Haute. So I got a little bit of East Coast and got a little bit of Midwest. So I had the best of both, as it were. And I think, that, and I'll come back to it, that had a big impact on me, different cultures and that kind of thing, in terms of, a medium-sized town in the Midwest is not the same as between Washington and New York and on the East Coast.
We're not in Kansas anymore, right? The Dorothy.
No, it's just different. It's just different. And another sort of key aspect in my upbringing is that my mom was raised Lutheran and my dad was raised Catholic.
Mm,
And when they got married back in 1948, it was easier for my mom to convert to
mm,
Catholicism than to try to do what they, in those days, they called it mixed marriages. Right.
right, right. Hmm.
And it, it, although it was it was a significant change for my mom, it wasn't a huge leap from Lutheran to Catholic. There's a handful of key doctrines that are different and everything, but it wasn't, the, the, the Sunday services were pretty similar and many of the beliefs were pretty similar. So, it was close enough, right?
Right.
Um, but the reason I bring that up is that the differences were sufficiently significant that my parents' understanding of God, for example, and the models and their notion of what God was like was different.
Mm,
Okay? And it was the case because we spent summers back in Terre Haute. More often than not, in the summertime, we would go to the Lutheran church
I was going to
because
say.
my mom's parents, and our extended family and all were there. My mother's mother was a charter member of that church, so that means she was one of the founding people of that church. It was a German Lutheran church. My mother's family had immigrated in from Germany. They were German Lutherans, so have all that kind of background. So that's how we tended to do religious services in the summer. We'd occasionally go to the Catholic church with my dad's mom and so on. But
Mhm.
the majority was Lutheran. So I had two strands, if you will, in terms of shaping my religious background, Lutheran and Catholic, with different attitudes toward the Bible and, like I say, different
Mhm.
models of God and things like that. So that
Right.
that also was really important. Um, the third kind of interesting piece story in my family background was on my dad's side. My dad's mom's one brother. He and his wife had 8 kids,
Mm,
3 boys, 5 girls. All 8 of them went into the religious life of some sort. The
wow.
3 boys all became priests. The 5 girls all became sisters,
Wow.
nuns, right? So the important part there is that the oldest son, roughly the same age as my parents, um, became a canon lawyer. And that's a person in the Catholic Church who really pays a lot of attention to doctrine and the rules and regulations and things of that sort. And the important part there is that he was an academic and was a head of a seminary and all that. But most importantly, he was one of the people at the Second Vatican Council who had a hand in thinking about and in the writing and what went into some of the documents that came out of the Second Vatican Council. So I had an inside look when I was 9, 10, 11 years old as to what was going on at a very pivotal point in the history of the Catholic Church in the
Right.
20th
I kind of
century.
did too. I have two aunts who are nuns, and
Mm-hmm.
my parents married in 1954. And I remember my mom saying when the nuns, my aunts, took their final vows, it was an interesting service and an interesting experience. But by the time I came along, Vatican II had already happened. And I would hear them say things like, well, we got back our last name and and we didn't have to wear the habit anymore at some point. And I could see the differences between the two sisters
Mm-hmm.
who were nuns. One was very, very much still streamlined religious, and the other one was more spiritual and more open. And,
Mm-hmm.
one took care of the other more than the other. And, I could see that. And I remember thinking, I've grown up Catholic, cradle Catholic, which I don't know if all cradle Catholics are as appreciative of their religion as they maybe could be or should be. Um, because, you grow up just doing things without the thought process of why you're
Mm-hmm.
doing them. I mean, my biggest thing was, why do we say and do the same thing every single Sunday, as though I could stay at home and say this in my bed? Those kinds of things. So, yeah, I get that. Watching that kind of experience does mold one's thinking.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah, and I think the other, among the influences, those conversations and really hearing what was going on at the council, um, had on me what was an understanding that, um, one of the intentions, certainly of many of the those who were participating at that time, was to really open up the church and to be a much more accepting body. One of the things that came out was a recognition of baptism from other denominations, to be much more open to different ways of looking at things, um, starting conversations about, how to be more um, accepting of differences of belief, not just even outside Christianity, to
mm,
recognize that there are many paths to God, right? And hearing about that, when you're 9, 10, 11 years old, that helped shape me, right?
mm-hmm,
And so as I grew up in Wilmington, my elementary and high school years, we were in Catholic schools of different sorts. My elementary school was um, populated by Franciscan sisters plus some lay teachers, and my high school was the Oblates of St. Francis de Sales. Um, both of those orders are very much about reaching out into
mm,
communities, serving serving people where they are, um, you know, serving people on the margins, all of that kind of thing. So that was a very heavy lean, as it were, in religion class and stuff like that.
yeah, same here with my aunts. They were Sisters of
Yeah.
Divine Providence.
Hmm. And so, and then my first year and a half of college was at a Jesuit institution in
Mm.
Philadelphia. So I got three three versions of, you need to be out in community and serving people,
Right,
and
right,
really paying attention to tradition, but also having a um, critical assessment of it for
right,
yourself. You have to do your reading, understand tradition, pray on it, really meditate on it, and understand that, there's you can't just look at one piece of it, like
right,
that proverbial story of the guys and the elephant, right? You can't just feel the leg and understand the whole thing.
right,
So and in our tradition, as you know, um, the Bible is one source, but it's not the only
right.
one. That's where we differ from some other denominations. It's not sola
Mm-hmm,
scriptura, right?
mm-hmm,
Um, so all of those things kind of influenced my spiritual side. And growing up in Washington to New York corridor during the 1960s and 70s
mm.
was also a pretty interesting place,
I can only
um,
imagine.
because there were, lots of stuff happened
Mm-hmm.
in those times, because of where we were. I was able, for example, to see Bobby Kennedy's funeral train on the way from New York to Washington.
Wow. Yeah.
My parents were very good at taking us to places. So we were down in Washington the weekend after President Kennedy was buried, the weekend after Bobby was buried,
Mm-hmm.
um, to that. And they always took us to, historical sites and the Smithsonian and all of those kinds of opportunities. We saw a lot of the social movements because of the geography. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I got to meet, when I was in college, for example, I met some of the Jesuits who were very active in various social justice movements,
Right.
and poverty movements, and all, simply because of the times and the fact that um, that they would drive through or take the train through Delaware, right, on the way to wherever it was they were going.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I was very fortunate in that sense to be able to be a witness to a lot of those kinds of events that other people either saw on TV or have read about in history books or
Mm-hmm.
something of that sort. And the fact that my parents were so good about taking us to these places so that we're 5, 6 years old and we're standing there at the Liberty Bell,
Right.
or down at Mount Vernon, hearing the histories of that kind of stuff. So, I was very, very lucky that, um, that those things were available. You could drive to them. Many of the museums in those days were free. The Smithsonian, of course, still is, but a lot of
Mm-hmm.
the other ones that aren't anymore. So I was able to get exposed to so many of these things, um, and just was curious as to so what's going on, and I had to ask a lot of questions and all that kind of stuff, and also because of the movements of the time, you were able to get exposed and interact with and get to know people across the whole spectrum
Right.
of opinion, and we're able to was able to see some of the organizations and the outreach efforts and all that were getting underway in the 1970s, and then in the early 1980s, had those opportunities to watch them grow.
Right.
You know, and ultimately, as my education progressed, I really only ever wanted to be a teacher. From the time I
Same
was a
here.
little kid.
That's
You
it.
know, none of the fire person,
Yeah.
firefighter, none of that stuff. None of that stuff ever attracted me. And it was only a matter of what age group it was going to be.
Right.
And I started out, when I got old enough, I would just ask, would I be happy teaching a class full of kids at the age at which I was? And I kept saying no until I hit college. And so I said, okay, well, let's give this a shot. And so I got interested in psychology, and particularly how people learn
Right.
and all. So ended up finishing my undergraduate degree at University of Delaware, and then going to Notre Dame for graduate school, which was a very interesting place because Father Hesburgh was the president there at the time, who was a one of the forces of nature that I was able to actually get to meet. He was very, very active in civil rights and international issues, particularly in Latin America, and
Mm.
all. And he brought all that back to Notre Dame.
Right.
Um, and then after that, I got into my academic career teaching psychology first at Bowling Green, and that was a pretty typical kind of career,
Right.
doing faculty and stuff like that. But the one thing that always stuck, and I guess the one continuous thread, was involvement in my parish, wherever that happened to be. From the time I was a kid, I was an altar boy and all of that kind of stuff back in the day. But even when I got to Bowling Green on the faculty there, I got very active in the campus ministry at Bowling Green at St. Thomas More in the parish there. Was very, very involved and helped co-lead the RCIA program, the Rite of Christian Initiation for adults. That's what it was called back in the 80s. And have been actively involved in campus ministry to this day, even in Chapel Hill now, where I live at the University of North Carolina, Catholic campus ministry. So that's been, that kind of activity and sort of continual curiosity about
Right.
spirituality and looking at things from different perspectives and what really are the differences across different denominations? What are the differences across different religions? And what can I bring back to my own practice that can enrich it? Whether that's through social outreach or whatever the case may be. There's something to be learned from sitting with Buddhists or sitting with Baptists. An interesting thread in my genealogy that I just learned just a few years ago was that way back on my family tree, on my dad's side of the family, were Swiss Germans who were among the early Anabaptists back in the 1520s and 1530s. Some of them were incarcerated, some of them were killed. And they were among the early settlers in Pennsylvania to help found the Mennonite Church in Pennsylvania and then subsequently in Shenandoah Valley.
Interesting.
So I've spent a little time learning more about my own heritage and all the different threads that put us together as people, and having an appreciation for it's not just Catholic and Lutheran, it's all these different threads, and you end up with a tapestry.
Well, I know, I attended, Catholic school as well as a young child. I attended Christ the King, which is here in Lexington, a very large parish, had a school attached. It was predominantly run by Sisters of Divine Providence nuns, like my aunts. The convent was right there on the property. And I knew Dr. Ralph. So she was a very early influence in my life. So Dr. Ralph is a theologian that lives here in Lexington. I went to school and graduated with her oldest son, Danny. And when I had her as a teacher in high school, she talked a lot about social justice, and that she would use that phrase, you can't have the church without you are the church. And that became to me that it didn't matter who you were or what your belief was, that the church wasn't really the building, that the people were the church.
That's right.
Well, that opened up my thinking even at that time in high school, thinking, but if people are the church and not all people are the same, then how do we fit into that building, and that building? And how can we all, believe differently and yet somehow be the church? Because then there's really no one right church, because we're all the church. So that was like, okay, that there's something has to be fleshed out about that thinking. And then, of course, you mentioned campus ministry. Being on a college campus, whether you're a student, professor, or someone who's working at the universities, the diversity on campus, even though it may not be what it could be on some campuses, but the diversity again opens up your mind to. I'm having friends that are completely different from me. Church is not at the forefront of who we are to each other. Like, we don't even talk about it. And yet we're going together to feed the hungry, or we're going together to do this or do that. So I started to realize that the church is much bigger than any one building. But yet, Dr. Cavanaugh, I guess we can't deny, church is also so dividing. Because today, in many communities, the church used to be, I don't know if it still is to the same degree as it once was, but many times in many communities, and you think about small communities in particular, the church was the center. And basically it was your work, your family, and your church. And if your life revolved around those three things, you were limited in some ways, because that's all you knew. And if you don't exist outside that community, then you become very isolated and insulated into your own thinking. But now we're so divided. And it isn't just the church, it is everything is so divided. So,
Mm-hmm.
where has that shift happened? Because I think it did happen in the 60s too. So, where are we headed?
Mm-hmm.
you know?
Yeah, yeah. I think at a certain level, um, you know, humanity has always had a tendency to pick teams, if you
Mm,
will, or sides, right?
mm,
Um, as far back as you look, um, as you get, you look at ancient history and all, and you get the different empires, the Persians and the Egyptians and all that, right? And nobody was ever satisfied with what land they had. They
right.
wanted the other guys, right? I mean, and so that you get it a little bit around that, and certainly, um, when you look at scripture, particularly the historical books in the Old Testament, all of the different um, groups and cultures that are written up in there, and the different religions and idols and gods and all the rest of that kind of stuff, and how many times were the Israelites told, now, we don't want you building a golden calf, or we don't want you doing, getting sort of enamored with the folk over here, um, to maintain, their own beliefs and keep their focus on where the focus needed to be kept.
Right.
And I think some of that is just a tendency to be more comfortable with the no, and people coming in from the outside, whether it was the Israelites coming into Canaan, or some invading army or whatever, you go, where are these people
The
coming from?
Irish coming into the United
Yeah, into the
States,
United States or
whatever. Yeah.
whoever, right? Whatever. And I think it's always been a struggle. And I certainly, learned a lot about this, and then we can talk about when I got first connected with the the notion of creation spirituality and stuff in the '80s, and have followed in that tradition. But even in the Gospels, I mean, um, Jesus goes back to Nazareth, preaches in a synagogue, and people start saying, "Who does he think he is?" I mean, he isn't. I thought I knew his dad, the carpenter.
Right.
And then he even says that a prophet is successful everywhere except home,
True.
right? And so even there, we've got a little bit of, and there's a number of stories of people who would walk up to the line, they would talk to him. They say, "What does it take for me to come to the kingdom?" He would tell them. He told the one guy, "Go sell everything, give it to the poor, come on back, and we'll talk." Right? And he goes, "I don't know. I'm not so sure." And so there was sort of the soft rejection. There's obviously the hard rejection, and then they killed him. Um, so even there, um, you had the cliques, as it were,
Hmm.
and even the apostles had arguments as to who was in the innermost group and who wasn't, and got James and John's mother going in trying to say, "Hey, can my boys have the best seats in heaven?" And so there's this kind of tendency. And I think, that what I take from the Gospels is Jesus's message is we got to set that aside because we've got a lot more in common, and and we're so much better together, than we are separate.
I always think about that when there is a national disaster here in the
Hmm.
United States. People don't ask, "Are you gay? What
No,
color are you?" Your house has
no,
been blown down by a tornado, and nobody cares
no,
about that
no,
stuff. And yet
no.
on Sunday, they got to know everything about your personal life before they'll let you in the door. And it's
Hmm.
like, you know, I do think that humans in general want to classify things.
Hmm.
And that comes down to, you're on the left, you're on the right, you're on this, you're on that, you believe this, you believe that. But you're right, the common ground, for me, it's, if you drink coffee, but that's a common ground. But if you don't drink
Yeah,
coffee, I still care about you and love you. You don't have to be like me. But that's again where that division happened. I mean,
right.
I had a priest once tell someone in my family who was not Catholic that basically religion is a circle, and most of the pie is exactly the same,
Hmm.
but there's one slice of the pie. The rituals within a religion
Hmm.
that differ from building to building to building, and from belief, and you know we argue more about that slice of pie. And I mean, we could argue that perhaps we feel like it's always the last slice of the
Hmm.
pie. And so there's
Hmm.
jealousy and need and greed or whatever. But that slice of the pie seems to represent what we disagree about and what we argue about. And we miss the whole rest of the pie. We don't even get to enjoy the rest of the pie because we're so worried about that last slice. And that also really influenced me because again, my family is Irish and Scottish. So Irish on my mother or on my
Hmm.
father's side, Scottish on my mother's side. Um, and the Durbins are one of the oldest Catholic families to have come through Maryland, supposedly into Kentucky with Daniel Boone and all of that, and had religion services in their homes. Well, growing up hearing that also says, so if you're having church in your home, it's not about the building. It's wherever
Hmm.
you're gathered. And it's wherever you're gathered together. And then not everyone was Catholic in our family. We had Baptists as well.
Hmm.
So even though but of course the split occurred at some point in time because somebody couldn't get a divorce, so you just leave the religion and go get one from another religion because that was the belief at the time. Um, it's interesting because you and I met through your class, which I still think a lot about because your class is like the epitome of my own walk in life. you know and I think about so many other people, and again, the social justice movement. I had no idea growing up that there was this, I always say, dirty little secret in the Catholic Church called Catholic social teaching.
Hmm.
And it was one of those things with, that you take care of the impoverished, and of course the impoverished is compounded by race and by not just money, but race and other issues in our society that are on the margins. But I don't think most people see that. They see the rituals of a church as the foundation and the history of the church as the foundation, rather than the message in the Bible that's a bigger picture. So how can we, I don't want to say fix it, but how can we get to a better place with such division? And it comes down to not just in our churches, but there's division in homes, in schools, in jails, in wherever you are gathered, there is division.
Hmm.
So, how do you think we will ever fix these things. Will we ever fix these things, Dr. Cavanaugh?
I think certainly for me, the path to fixing it is there. Whether we choose to take it is of course a different matter. But I think
a different animal.
Yeah, I think the path is there, and for me, it starts in what does it say in the Gospels? You know, so when an individual who how shall I put this, would be responsible for making a devout Jew ritually unclean, right? And there was a lot of ritual purity laws and stuff in those days. So a leper, a woman with a hemorrhage, right? Any kind of blood, right? Jesus didn't go, ew, I can't, right? Get away, right? He didn't do that. He said, come closer and let me see what I can do, right? And we're gonna have to work together because there's always a dialogue of some sort, right? So there is this collaboration of a sort between, okay, so what is it that you want? Because he would usually ask, what are you seeking, right? And they would say, well, I'd like to see, or whatever the case may be, right? I'd like to have my daughter come back or whatever. And he would say, okay, well, let's see here. And he would touch lepers. He touched people who were bleeding. The whole, one of the big parts about the Good Samaritan parable was the first two that passed by couldn't touch what could have been a dead body because they would have been ritually impure. And then the Samaritan goes over, picks him up, puts him on his donkey or whatever, and took him to an inn. All right. And his point was, look, when people are in need, you pay attention to the need.
Right.
And if you put everything else second to that, the fact that they have leprosy, the fact that they, whatever their issue happened to be, okay,
or sometimes what you think their issue is,
right? That's right. And I think that the message for us is subordinate the social label that we have applied, rightly or wrongly, right, is not the key defining characteristic of this person who has come to us with a need or a hurt or a trauma or for whatever reason.
Right.
And it's that we need to deal with first, just like Jesus did, right? And then afterwards, he said, "Oh, gee, that's not." And then everybody else was more concerned about the social label. People would say, "Well, I can't believe that he's having dinner with a tax collector or whatever, right? I mean, how could he possibly do it?" Right? But those externally applied labels didn't matter to him.
Right.
It was what was the person seeking and what was the need. If we approach people from that point of view, then it becomes a lot harder to say people who have this particular label, I don't need to know anything else about them because I just say they're not worthwhile people.
Right.
That's not, for me anyway, that is not what happened with Jesus. That's not the story. Okay.
That's not the story. That's right. That's not the story.
And so so for me, getting past the polarization issue has a lot to do with how do we first engage with another person. The fact is, all of us are seeking something, right?
Mm-hmm.
And all of us at some point will ask ourselves the same set of questions. Why am I here? What's
Right.
the purpose of my life? What happens after I die? How do I find meaning in my life? That kind of stuff. All of us have that in common,
And that's where I think
and none of us are perfect, right? We all,
religion
we all. That's right.
religion became the source to answer that question. But
Mhm.
as I have walked in my life, I realized that if I take the notion that I'm created in God's image, and I take it literally or figuratively or however I define that. If I'm created in God's image, if not physically, then mentally and emotionally or spiritually, then at some point where who I am and my purpose, it comes from within.
Mhm.
And if I label that as my God because I am in his image, then it makes it easier for me to see that everything I do, think, say, believe, touch, wish to be involved in, it's all coming from the same source, whether it's God or whether it's from within. But yet we use religion as the way to define that. But for those in our country and in the world who are not of any particular religion, at the very minimum, we're all human.
Mhm.
And so, you know, again, it's things like this, having a conversation with someone. I often challenge at the end of the podcast, go have a conversation with someone who doesn't look like you, think like you, believe like you, or have a lived experience like you, because that's where the basis of getting to know someone on a level other than inside that building or some label they have.
Mhm.
But we don't often do that. I grew up at a time when you didn't lock the front door, and
Right.
we slept outside because we didn't have an air conditioner, and
Mhm.
no one ever thought twice about it. But now, not only are we isolated in some ways from each other, um, but we're isolated in general, even though we have the best technology in the world to be having conversations like this all the time, and yet we don't.
That's right.
Um, all the
Mhm.
religions started in the same place, in the same region of the world, and yet um, it's just interesting to really think about. Um, so, as someone asked in our class, at this point in time, is religion the best vehicle to come together? Or is religion something that polarizes the nation in a way that we can't undo or unsee because we've done it for so long? As I mentioned in your class, they say it takes 100 years to change a norm. And every day that you don't make movement, that's another day off the 100 years that you don't make the change. And Lord knows we see that we don't make changes in education, justice. I don't know. It's a lot to think about, but what are your
Yeah.
thoughts?
Yeah. And I think not to get hung up in definitions and that kind of stuff. If you look at um, the core aspects of religion, right, minus the bureaucracy and the institutionalization pieces, right?
Mm-hmm.
And get it down to what are the guiding principles,
Okay.
right? Then a lot of the, at least for me anyway, in folks that I've talked to, a lot of the religious, not religious, falls away because at core, the principles by which people live their lives tend to be more similar than not.
Mm-hmm.
Doing, sort of the golden rule kind of thing,
Mm-hmm.
and the do unto others kind of attitude. Generally want to be nice to people, that kind of, don't cheat, that kind of stuff, right? Once you start wrapping around a lot more rules, regulations, bureaucracy, institutionalization, that can easily go awry.
Mm-hmm.
We know that whether it's government, whether it's religion, whether it's a corporation, whether
Education.
it's a university, right?
Mm-hmm.
Pick your favorite organization. They go off the rails, okay?
Right.
And power goes to people's heads and all of that. But if you look at the principles, okay, I think that if we really sit down and just talk about what are the principles that guide our lives, and come at the conversation that way, we have
Mm-hmm.
that circle is a lot more. Those circles are a lot more overlapping than we sometimes think they are. Okay.
Right. Right.
I would also say that for people, in the in the universe of people who look at what we call the Bible, what other people look at as scripture, and there's some overlap, in the Abrahamic religions of some of those texts and all that kind of stuff, right? Um, I think we can look at that as a place to start, because if you have a concept of a higher power, whether you call it God or whatever label you want to attach to it, um, but for me, I have a higher power that I choose to call God. Um, if you want to just even take it at face value, where it says, people were made in God's image and likeness, that's where the sentence ends, right? There's no except for.
Right. Right. Right.
Okay, so either it's everybody or it's nobody,
No one.
right?
That's what I was going to say. Or it's no one.
Okay,
And
so if
Lord
we
knows we're
if
not
if
ready to go there, right?
so for I when I'm engaged in conversations with people for whom scripture is very core to who they are, I'm at a loss to figure out, so where is that sentence, because it's not in my copy, right?
Right.
It's just not. Um, and so, for me, that's a pretty um, central place for conversation.
That's a
To
depolarizing statement.
Right, because to be polarized means you have to have an answer to, well, where, except for who, right?
Right.
Who, right? And then it's it's not, you don't have a basis in scripture for that. Okay.
Right. Right.
And I think for others, like I said, if I often have conversations with, because I'm around a lot of college students, because I've always hung out, I've always worked at universities, right? And so the people who say I'm spiritual but not religious, okay, I say, okay, fine, right? That doesn't matter.
I
But let's
say
talk
that.
about,
Do I know what
that's
it
cool.
really means? No.
Yeah. And so, okay, so talk to me about what are the moral, ethical principles that guide your life, and they'll tell me, and I'll say, well, that's really interesting, because in this group over here, in the big tent called Christianity, right? We got some kind of similar stuff,
Hmm.
And so and we have conversations, and um, and just pointing out that, look, I'm not telling you got to be inside my tent,
Right.
okay? But at a higher level of analysis or aggregation, depending on how you want to look at it, right? We're more similar than we're different in what we say are the pillars around which we organize our life.
I think the
And I
pandemic.
think for
Oh, go
and
ahead.
for some, and I think for some people that then diffuses all of the negative baggage that religion brings into the conversation, because there's not one that has a perfect history.
Right.
Um,
Right.
and I think the certainly the pandemic didn't made us think differently about what it means to come together, because
Hmm.
once we went virtual and things like that, we have different ways of participating. It's not the same, but at least there are ways that we're doing it now, having a virtual interaction. We're not
And
in the
it
same
brought
physical space.
struggle. I think
Yeah.
that's another thing. I think when we read scripture, you see the struggle
Hmm.
of the common versus an entity that is bigger than yourself that
Right.
can somehow ease your burden.
Hmm.
And I think that during the pandemic, everyone was experiencing, perhaps in many ways for the first time, the same thing.
That's right.
And, it's kind of like before the pandemic and after the pandemic. It
Hmm.
will always be that line in history when something shifted.
Hmm.
And for some, myself included, the struggle came in different ways than perhaps many of us with privilege didn't experience prior. And we were, I don't want to say stuck at home, but we were at home
Hmm.
experiencing a silence and a quiet that we hadn't had before. And for some of us, it took us inside. And
Hmm.
also television, we could see so much death
Hmm.
among every community,
Hmm.
but we also saw death among certain communities at higher rates.
That's right.
And you couldn't unsee that.
No.
It's sort of like when you think about it, the body bags coming home from Vietnam.
Hmm.
I grew up with that on the television. So, those kinds of moments make you realize that we are more common than we are different, that we have more in common, I should say, than we are different.
Hmm.
And I think that's where we need to remember really who we are and where we've been and where we're going, because that shift in thinking makes us reach out during a tornado, makes us reach out during a hurricane,
That's
makes
right.
us reach out during, civil unrest, whatever the cause may be. Um, but I think that we sometimes come together only to then go back to our families, because that is, I mean,
Hmm.
family is the basis.
Hmm.
For many of us as a refuge. Not always good, not always bad, not always something we can define or understand, you know, but family has also become one of those places where my chosen family has become online, much
Hmm.
more so than family, feet on the ground, Sunday
Hmm.
dinner kind of thing. And that again opens up your world. So I agree. There are some shifts, and it depends upon whether you, I guess, wish to see it, number one.
Hmm.
But I guess before you see it, you have to be aware that it exists, and you have to see it.
Right.
But then you have to be willing to walk walk
Hmm.
that way towards someone or something. Um, because I agree, the basic question is, why are we here, and
Hmm.
what happens when we're not, and the purpose, um, the purpose of my life and what I should be doing or not doing, or whatever. That's what defines us.
That's right.
Um,
And I think, like you say, the reaching out to other people, let's say at a disaster, or, a fire or something of that sort, that also says that that's a common aspect of people when that kind of thing happens, because at some level you understand that could have been me,
right, right,
right?
right,
And there, but for the grace of God, and so on. So that brings out another common aspect of us. It's not just the would like to hang out with people that are like us. It's also, we have a deep seated um, desire to help other people that we see are hurting, right?
right,
And that's a deep, deep human nature thing. And it's how do we reward people, or sort of nudge people to say, hey, you felt good, didn't you? And it made, because people say, I got so much more back than I gave, and
right,
all that
right,
kind of thing. So I say, okay, well, if you like to feel good, maybe do it again.
right,
Just a little way, in a little way, right? And that way you'll feel good more than you used to.
right.
And maybe that's a piece of it too.
Well,
You
I
know,
know we're coming up on the hour, and I know that you have a hard stop, and I want to respect that. So, I want to give you a moment to collect a final thought. And in that moment, I'm going to do a shameless plug. So,
okay.
so
Um,
um, you've been tuned in to Love Over Coffee. Voices Not Heard. This is a platform and a podcast for the marginalized, the silenced, and the abused. And out of this podcast, we have created a subscription box series. And that subscription box is a quarterly box. It is focused on self love, self care, and healing trauma. Because until you can really connect with self, it is very difficult to connect with another. Because sometimes we often lead with our trauma rather than lead with um, love and compassion. We heal from the inside, and if we don't heal that, then that's what we lead with, and that trauma can trigger you in ways that keep you isolated, and isolation keeps you from growing and perhaps loving another as much as maybe one could or should or would without trauma. So the box is quarterly. If it is something you're interested in, send a message to the Real Change page. This particular podcast is being recorded, but there are ways to engage either through Messenger. I'm very public on my own personal Facebook page, Tina M. Durbin. I have the Real Change business page, which is where this podcast will exist. I also have YouTube. So go like, share, subscribe, do whatever it is you need to do social media wise so you can keep up with us. And in that shameless plug, I will stop and now turn to Dr. Cavanaugh, my guest today. And I want to say, I hope this is one of many conversations. So I hope that we can continue because this is an important topic and conversation. So, what are your final thoughts before we say goodbye?
sure. First, I want to thank you again, Tina, for inviting me on the show. And I would just like to close by saying I'm actually very optimistic that the phase that we're going through will come to an end, and people will come back together, because I think that part of us as humans that draws us together, and bonds us together, is more powerful than those forces that push us apart.
I agree. I agree. I think that people are inherently good,
Mhm.
whether it comes from God or being human or being whatever, whomever, at whatever time. People are inherently good, and we know that. We just sometimes forget it.
That's
Um,
right.
well, I want to again thank you, of course, for coming on. As I mentioned, I hope that this is one of many conversations that we are able to have. I know you have a busy schedule. My schedule is about to get busier, and the podcast took a little break because of my own dental work. Except you don't know, the dental work didn't happen that day because my blood pressure was off the charts. And so we have a backup date, August 15th, my brother's birthday and Feast of the Assumption. So we will hopefully um, go in a little bit more relaxed now that I kind of know what to expect. We know where we're going this time. I mean, I was there early last time, but you know, uh, whomever you believe in out there, send up some good vibes, some prayers, something, that it goes well. So August 15th at 7:15 in the morning, we are going to try again. So with that, I again want to thank you, and I will end the recording, and thank you all for who are tuning in. This will air probably the first week in September, and I'll let you know so you can share it out and all that. Okay. All right. So let me go ahead and end the recording.